It's me. It's me.
Fly it over.
We're almost there.
Just give her an old taparoo when you're ready, Gordon. I don't know. Some bugs in the system. One more time. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hello, Canby, and welcome to our regularly scheduled meeting on Monday, February 27th, the Canby Planning Commission. Please join us in the Pledge of Allegiance to get started. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. First order of business, we have consent items. And Planning Director Hardy, you wanted to talk about adopting the draft of previous meeting minutes?
Yes, Chair Ellison, if there's a motion, if the Planning Commission has reviewed the minutes, I'd like a motion and a second to adopt the May 9th, 2022 draft meeting minutes as final.
I'll make a motion, we adopt the minutes as submitted.
I second.
All right. Director Hardy, do you want, were you saying you wanted all individual votes again for any motion?
Yes, that would be our preference. I mean,
roll call
I think
style.
this one probably could be done as unanimous because I'm guessing there's not going to be any, I would say if there's any dissent.
Okay. All right. All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Aye. Aye. All against? The ayes have it. The meeting minutes have been adopted. Next item is citizen input on non-agenda items. This is an opportunity for members of the public to address the Planning Commission on non-agenda items. Each person will be given 3 minutes to speak. Staff and the Planning Commission will make every effort to respond to questions raised during citizens' input before the meeting ends or as quickly as possible thereafter. Do we have any citizen input on non-agenda items?
None on Zoom.
And none present in the room. Okay, moving forward. New business, there is no new business. And there are no public hearings tonight. So next up is our work session. The purpose of tonight's work session is to give the Planning Commission the opportunity to discuss Planning Commission processes and procedures. To make the most of the short time we are given for these work sessions, public comment will not be taken. Instead, we invite the public comment at all of the Planning Commission's regular meetings under either of the 2 opportunities dedicated on each agenda for public comment. In addition, we invite the public to contact city staff with comments or concerns. Although this is a public meeting, the Planning Commission cannot make any formal decision in a work session. Next step actions are often determined for deliberation and discussion at the properly noticed Planning Commission hearing. Okay, the Planning Commission, let's see, we have presenters Joe Lindsay, City Attorney, and Don Hardy, Planning Director. And what items? I don't have any packet items.
No, there's just a PowerPoint presentation tonight and just a little brief introduction for that. Again, this is another opportunity we've had these before, kind of a refresher. on processes and procedures. There's also some trainings that I'm hoping to provide to the Planning Commission. Those are Department of Land Conservation and Development trainings. Generally, they're talked about how to stay out of hot water for planning commissioners. I'm paraphrasing, but there's a series of those that typically come out in the spring. Those are generally in the evening, and that's something else I'd like to offer. This is just another chance to have our attorney, Joe Lindsay, here before us tonight to help us through some of those processes and procedures. It's an open forum for questions and items to basically have the planning commissioners have the ability to ask questions. Joe's going to lead us into the beginning of this, and then at the end, I have some clear and objective standard information I'd like to share as well, which is going to be about the standards that we use as planning commissioners, where there's discretion, where there's not discretion, to touch on that. And then I was going to also touch on some House bill legislation briefly, which is up and coming, dealing with housing and affordability. The state legislature has some fairly aggressive House bill that they're forwarding on in their current session, and just wanted to make sure you're up to speed on that as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe.
Good evening, guys. I think, unfortunately, if that isn't working, I think you have to turn around to see the PowerPoint presentation if you're a visual learner. But I should also say, if you've been here, for maybe a year and a half, I think we did this almost exact same presentation before, and I think some people, when they onboarded, even watched the video. So this may seem like a bit of deja vu for folks. My apologies, except that I always find, what is it, you're supposed to hear something 12 times before you actually really, it sinks in. So maybe a second time isn't it's worth enough, And the other kind of admonition I want to say right before we start is that when we do this, it's a workshop. It's kind of about the processes and kind of wrapping your head around acting like a judge. And so we can't actually use specific cases that could potentially come before you, because we want to make sure that, we're not saying stuff, talking out of school, or kind of ruining a record that you'll have in the future about cases. So we're going to have to limit our discussion kind of to more abstract and more kind of hearings in general. And so with that, we've started out by saying we're going to parse this up where there's kind of, when you're acting like a judge, I think there's before the hearing, during the hearing, and after the hearing, to kind of think about it, break it up in some which way. And I think threes are always a way that we're comfortable thinking about stuff. So before the hearing, really, in order to be like a judge and be in quasi-judicial hearing mode, right, you want to make sure that you're unbiased and impartial. And so in our city, I think, always strives for not only actually being unbiased and impartial, but also even the perceptions, so that the community thinks that there's fairness. We have to ensure that there's fairness, but I think we also want to make sure that the perception is that there's fairness and impartiality and unbiased in the way we approach things. So the first and foremost, you guys, when you open up a hearing, right, or right before the hearing, you're going to talk about whether or not you have conflicts, and those are defined under Oregon ethics law, under Oregon revised statute. It's ORS 244-020, and they say et al., but just basically all of the other ones right around it. And the long and the short of conflicts is you can either have an actual conflict or a potential conflict. And an actual conflict would mean that you would benefit or avoid a detriment for yourself or your family member or the business you work for. So if you have an actual conflict, you would want to declare it on the record, and you would want to then rightly say, I'm not only not going to participate, maybe I'm going to get out of my seat, walk down here, and just be an observer, so that nobody can say that you sat there and participated at all, because you don't want to run afoul of ethics. If you have a potential conflict, that is that there could somehow in some meaningful way downstream, there could be a potential benefit or an avoidance of a detriment to you or a family member or your business. And those are then, if it's just speculation, what you have to do is announce that, but then you don't necessarily have to not participate because it's just speculating whether or not it could be a benefit or an avoidance of a detriment. And so therefore, you could participate, but basically you want to make a record that you can still be fair and impartial. And what it does is it gives the applicant or even opponents or proponents an opportunity to ask you questions. And so that it kind of clears up in advance of going into being a judge whether or not you're going to actually be impartial and unbiased, because you might vote a certain way because you own stock in a company that's in front of you or something. I don't know. That would actually be an actual bet. So what do I have here? Self or family have skin in the game. So yeah, when you're thinking about what is actual conflicts, I think most people know, if it's your family, your immediate family, or you or your business, that you have skin in the game. Even if, it's an affiliate of, some people work in construction, and so I think you just want to be careful, or you're off to the side, but you're in the field. And I think planning commissions gravitate towards sometimes, or people gravitate towards planning commissions that are in the field, and we actually gain from the experience and the expertise of that, right? It's like having a true jury of your peers. Like jury systems in the beginning used to actually be, if there was a dispute between milk farmers, they would pretty much grab milk farmers. So that you kind of know, everybody knows what you're talking about. Nowadays, we kind of have a bit more random system, but the idea is there will probably be friends or associates or affiliations. And so you just have to, if those even exist, it's always good to just be above board and say, hey, I know these people, I've known them for 20 years, but I'm going to be fair and impartial. Does anybody have any questions? And so that's kind of dealing with the conflicts up front. And then obviously it's for transparency reasons, and also for building a good record, which is important. So do you want to go to the next slide?
Sure.
The other thing you want to, part of the being unbiased and impartial, is whether or not, and this is ex parte, I don't know, did we? Oh, yours yours a little different than mine. I can follow yours.
Okay.
Because this was my original. So this one talks about the nature of public hearings. I will say this about ex parte contact. So ex parte simply means that one side gets to talk to a judge without the other side present when there's a matter that's going to come before that judge. So in this case, if one side comes to you and starts to kind of advocate ahead of a hearing, you give them a couple hours of your time or whatever it is, the other side has a right to know that. And I think truly the whole body, because you're deciding as a body, should know what that information is too. So part of the ex parte disclosure is, yeah, by the way, this guy caught my ear over at the coffee shop for an hour. And the long and the short of that was he said this, and this. I'm sure we'll hear all of the points here, but I just wanted to be clear that they had contact with me and I can still participate because I'm going to listen to everything here, and I wanted to make sure and share the information that I got. So that's also for transparency's sake and for building a good record. And it also gives people then the opportunity to hear what has been said to you outside of here, right? So there's no secrecy, and it gives any opponents or proponents the idea of rebutting that or bolstering it or whatever it is, right? So basically, you want to make sure that you're personally don't have a dog in the fight with the conflicts, and that you haven't given somebody an upper footing outside of the hearing, so that the hearing itself is kind of a universe unto itself for the purposes of fairness and transparency. So where are we at up here? I guess the other thing is you want to be able to assure people if one side got to you, or you knew somebody for years and years and years, or you know what I mean, they talked to you a little bit about it. You also want to kind of make that assurance that I haven't made my decision ahead of time, right? That I'm going to wait to hear all the evidence before I make my decision. And that all these things probably seem obvious, but what's funny is in the world of law, people run afoul of these things. So, and sometimes it's maybe, as long as we have best practices and we don't forget to always talk about our conflicts and whether or not we've had ex parte contact ahead of time. Those are just best practices, and we want to make sure and be honest. Because it's not like you can get in trouble for having done something, been talked to or whatever, but you could get in trouble for not divulging that. So might as well always kind of be above board with that. And then part of this as we get in, because this isn't all about ex parte, is this notion of getting prepared. So the last two bullet points on this really are about, you guys have enormous reading material as planning commissioners. And really a big part of your preparation should be, whether there's some major issues and whether you've spotted them, so that you can hone in on that ahead of the hearing, so you know what you're listening for. So I think it's always a good idea to do issue spotting ahead of time as part of your prep, which is, I'm not going to sit here and be completely inundated with a million things. I'm going to have 2 or 3 things that I'm really listening for, because those to me seem like the important issues, because everything else seems pretty much cut and dry. And then what's nice about issue spotting ahead of time is then if one other thing comes up, you're not listening to everything, so it seems like one thing might pique your interest. You know what I mean? You're actually a better issue spotter in real time if you think you've gotten most of the issues that you're gonna listen for done ahead of time in your prep. Then one weird thing comes up, it's easier to hear it, if that makes sense. So I'd always encourage making sure that those issues, and we have this later on, I think, as far as with staff, but staff actually issue spots for you and tries to telegraph that too. They try to bring up, this is kind of what staff is grappling with, and this is kind of, some of the stuff that the applicant wanted, and maybe they, we've kind of worked with them around, because they were trying to push this far, and we've said that we think that this is kind of, meets a straight face test or something like that. So staff to a large degree will issue spot for you and kind of raise those up. There may be others, so that's what's nice about having a panel of folks, is that you do better. It's like a jury, like all people from different walks and different thinkers actually might hone in on something. So that's always helpful for trying to come up with the best answers. And then the standards and criteria is a bullet point really that the last, I think, 2 slides are going to be talked about even more. The clear and objective standards and the criteria that you're being asked to consider and or apply You want to make sure that you understand those ahead of time. And if there is any question, please feel free to reach out to me or to Dawn about what, if there is something that seems a little bit off, or even if you just want to kind of double check. So don't be afraid to use staff as resources for that, because it really is helpful if you're grappling with, how is this supposed to work, or do you mean that this is what I think I'm hearing, right? Yeah, Mr. Ellison.
So one thing that I'm still a little bit fuzzy on is little self-imposed field trips. So, for example, we're grappling with the fencing standard issue internally for code. So I like to go drive around. I've been on the other side of 99, this side of 99, and I'm seeing all these different examples of different fencing issues that exist. So along those same lines, let's say there's a project coming down the road and it's Project X located at Block A. For the purpose of trying to get my head into what they're trying to do on a set of drawings, going on my own volition to Project X site and just checking it out,
That's allowable. It's just you should report it as ex parte contact in that you've driven by the site.
Got it.
And so you'll see this a lot with the council will say that too every time these come up. They'll say, well, nobody's talked to me, but I have driven by the site.
Gotcha.
And so again, it's funny. You learn a lot from actually going out and seeing places and seeing maybe how tight they are, or how, you know what I mean, or how open they are, all that sort of stuff. So, and it makes it, I think, more interesting. When you're talking about it, it makes it more real world. So it's kind of hard. Now, if you went out and you kind of snapped a whole bunch of photos and you were like, angling towards something, I think that could potentially start to look like bias. You know what I mean? So if you went out with opponents and you were snapping a bunch of photos and all that,
sure.
then suddenly you don't quite look like you're, impartial. So, but I don't think that would probably happen. Although it has a history of these things.
It could happen. So yeah.
I think there's two different scenarios in what you're saying. One is the fence code. Take that for example. That's a code issue, and I have a problem with going out and taking 1,000 pictures. Dawn would probably like to see those before we get to the meeting, and I start throwing them up on or Ryan would like to see them before we start throwing them up on the screen. If it's a public hearing, that's a whole nother ballgame.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's important that when we open a meeting, and I've noticed that we don't necessarily do this anymore, but I think it's important for the commissioners to say, do you have any ex parte contact, whatever. I visited the site, I drew no conclusions. I visited the site and I did see this, and you put it out there.
Yeah.
And then that gives the applicant or the opposing situation or the applicant a time to, then they can question.
Yeah.
You say, well, you said this, what does that mean? If you already made up your mind, we'd like to see him off of there, and they could have an issue with that. That's happened. But there's difference between a code situation and a public hearing situation.
So along those lines, and this is where I know folks have run afoul, so I just want to be really, really clear. If Michael and I are talking about an upcoming project, and it's like, you know what, let's run out there really quick and go look at this thing.
Yeah.
Verboten, or?
No, that's fine.
What if Michael and Dan and Craig and I go out there?
Then if you have a quorum,
So if you
have a massive issue because you should have announced that you had a
You
quorum.
take different vehicles.
Yeah.
Roger that.
Well, and then hopefully here's the other issue with serial meetings, right? So if the three of you meet and then one of you decides to talk with the fourth person about what you guys all saw, then you also have an issue.
forwarding emails is someplace with these kind of things. Suddenly you can develop a quorum without even an
Yeah.
intention
Through a thread
of your-
email.
Yeah, exactly. And that was something that was brought up. I went to one of those trainings. It was down
Yeah.
in Salem, and that was the first time I'd heard of it. There was another commissioner there who said that some people had run afoul of it in her office. And
Well-
it was just like, they were just trying to wrap their brains around something and passing these emails
Yeah,
back
yeah.
and forth. But then, the opposition said, you guys are making decisions without
Yeah.
starting a meeting, so.
Roger that.
They had to start all over.
Well, and what's so interesting about emails, right? Because we can wrap our heads around that because it's kind of like a visual idea, right? Like, oh, okay, yeah, sending an email to that person, and it seems like you could prove it. But the reality is, any deliberation, so even verbal deliberations, if you're on the phone and three of you go out and then somebody calls up a fourth one, even though you're not proving it, it's the same idea, right? You're deliberating together, and you're especially if you're telling them, yeah, we three went out there. What's the deal with that? We were thinking this, and what are you thinking? It kind of all of a sudden you have four people of a hive mind because you've deliberated ahead of the hearing. So yeah, don't do that.
Roger that.
And don't do the emails because it's easier to prove.
Yeah, exactly. Bad news bears.
Okay, so from there, now we're at the hearing, and unless you guys want to talk about kind of before the hearing stuff at all anymore. Okay, so then during the hearing, and I do like your idea too of framing up, if I went out there and I drew no conclusions, that would be an extra nice thing to say.
We always used to do that.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
I like it.
I would always poll each commissioner, and we would, start.
Yeah.
I visited the site, I drew no conclusions, or I visited,
Yeah.
I drew no conclusion. I mean, it was just whatever. It just put it out there
Yeah.
so people knew. And I think personally, I think that's from
Yeah.
getting it on the right playing
Yeah.
field. That's the right way to handle it.
Well, and so you know how people will say, and it's almost like, no conflicts will participate, right, or whatever. I always like too, if there's some sort of affiliation, and oh, I've known this guy for 20 years, but I can still be fair and impartial is another way to, kind of put everybody at rest. And if anybody has any questions.
And we always used to say that too.
Yeah.
It was if you had a communication with somebody, you stated the communication.
Yeah.
And then you say, and I plan to participate in the hearing.
Yeah. So those are
or
all,
not, or I
really
plan
good to have. Yeah.
on stepping down.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one way or the other.
Well, and which is, I think, that's the way not only it should be, but it's very honorable, right?
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, I guess, the only time you get jammed up in a way is, say you guys are down a few members, do you have a quorum problem? Maybe can you sit up with this notion of, I'm only going to be here so that we can actually have the meeting.
Well,
But I'm not gonna influence it
And
whatsoever.
that for was a question. I mean, it's a question. So let's just say that there was a conversation. I had a conversation with somebody.
Yeah.
I could say that I drew no conclusions. I
Yeah.
plan to participate, but I'm not planning on voting.
You can do that if you want. You can abstain from a vote if you just don't feel
I plan
fair.
on- So I can hear it, I can talk
Yeah.
about it, but then you can abstain from the vote.
Yeah. Just be careful, I guess, if the whole idea is you're not voting because you don't think you could be fair, then if you're influencing, being partial, whether or not that's worth it too.
Right.
So you might want to limit your participation then if you really do think that you're not going to vote.
So we can talk about past cases, right, that have already been.
Yeah.
Done. Okay, so we had like the backstop, their future build out.
Mm-hmm.
In that particular case, I'm directly plumbing that thing. So 100%
Yeah.
direct conflict.
Yeah.
Right? And at that point, really, that's the one where I kind of was wondering, like, should I have like got down from here?
Yeah.
Sat out there,
It
or
would be-
just
it would-
stayed silent?
It would look better.
Got it.
You know what I mean? Like you could literally sit there and not, just, if you
Well, you
like
could
that seat.
officiate the
Those seats
meeting.
aren't as comfy. It's one of the issues.
100%.
Right, he could officiate the meeting,
Yeah.
And he could actually even officiate the public hearing in that, but he could just make it clear that I'm not going to participate in the discussion or in the vote.
Right.
And I abstain from that, but he could still officiate the meeting.
Yeah, I think it would almost be safer because to not.
You're right.
And for all sorts of reasons, but so the Oregon ethics rules do say, and I'm sorry I don't have it with me right now, that if you do have an actual conflict and you're supposed to state it, and then you're supposed to not participate.
Right, yeah.
And so would somebody, if they were scorned and say the vote was close, would they say, oh, and by the way, the way he, called the balls and strikes in the meeting,
They could.
you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's I think better to protect yourself in that case because it's not worth an ethics, complaint to just sit on one, sit up there versus sitting down there when you weren't going to participate anyway.
So to use your example, you could officiate the meeting up to the public hearing,
And then I'd punt to you. And then go sit down over there.
whatever, and you could just go sit down. You could stay here, I guess, but
You could.
going and sitting down is probably make the applicant more,
Yeah.
or the opposition more comfortable.
Yeah, I think so.
And he still counts towards quorum, though.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, cool. So during the hearing, hearings clearly are, and you guys have kind of the processes and how you're supposed to value things in the code itself, depending on the type of hearing. But I mean, the long and the short of this is the just rights of property owners versus, the rights of the community at large, and kind of that balancing act of people might be applying for something that the city may or may not, really truly have the legal ability to do. Or they might be asking for something that is, within reason and within the clear and objective standards. And so, there's property rights, and then there's the rights of the community, and then there's also the rights of the process itself. And so during the hearing, we want to make sure that we're trying to create the best record possible. Right, so all of those considerations going in, basically, you want to give equal time to folks. You want to give, and you want to follow the rule. You don't want to just shut somebody down early or something like that, right? Which seems obvious, I guess. But you also want to, when you're building a record, like allow folks at the end, if they're getting, some lawyers and some presenters are better at this, but if they're getting to a point where they're starting to sense that people aren't liking what they're selling, and they get to a point where they want to add more evidence, right? So during the hearing, it's kind of essential, really, that before you close the hearing, that if they're asking for the ability to do additional evidence, that then there is an adherence to that, and that also some level of giving the other side a way to rebut that too. Sometimes people will say, okay, fine, we'll give you 10 days, and then you have 10 days to, respond to it or whatever it is.
So in that
Or a
instance, that's where I'm a little fuzzy too, because I think we kind of lost control of the Q&A back and forth for the proponent in one instance in the past. So it's a pretty straightforward formula you want us to follow, or you expect us to follow in terms of it's 5 minutes for this, 3 minutes for that, 10 minutes for this? Or is it kind of like we deliberate and create kind of our set guidelines as a body and then put that out?
Well, and there's also the balancing act of if you guys have 3 hearings that night and you don't want to be here, getting really punchy by the end and not really giving the third applicant a good hearing either. So there's a balancing act there too.
Don't promise that that's never, ever going to happen.
Well,
So far, I've held
I think he signed it in blood too. I'm pretty sure I saw
it's
it.
tricky, right? Because technically the evidence that's coming in is during the hearing itself, right? And so it really is kind of a race. You're off to the races trying to say as much as you can in order, and there's a lot of paper that goes into the record as well. So hopefully that kind of covers a decent amount of it, and then they're good at limiting it. But yeah, I guess it would stink to burn the clock on an applicant. If you just kept asking really kind of tough questions that were a little off to the side and just kind of kept them from actually getting their evidence in. But see, then they could always just ask for that additional evidence, that open window.
And I think just to add to that, this probably predates most of the folks on the Planning Commission. I think sometimes the applicant needs to clarify the situation. And in some circumstances, I believe a continuance is the appropriate path versus if there's a huge preponderance of evidence by the opponents that's put forward and it's looking like it's not going to be positive for the applicant because they've not been able to refute that, it may be a good idea to plant the seed of a continuance versus continuing on with closing the hearing and having deliberation. We're a little bit challenged in some ways as a planning commission because that really is our vehicle, is a continuance, or you make a decision that night. I mean, Joe is mentioning what you typically see in hearings examiner formats where you give people the opportunity to provide additional information, but really the vehicle here as a planning commission has to be in the form of a continuance to be able to continue that discussion and have that record remain open without a decision being made. And there were some bad examples of that previously where the applicant didn't necessarily articulate it very well and they didn't have a really good standing for getting an approval and ended up getting a denial. Then it went to the council and then it got remanded back to the planning commission.
And that's a long continuance.
It's a long continuance. Like we're talking 3 or 4 months of this journey that we're all going through versus that night just saying, it might be good for you to come back in 2 weeks. I mean, that would be, or a month, whatever that is. That's perhaps a better, more useful use of time.
And isn't there the time clock on some of these cases that you have to consider?
Yeah.
If it, 120-day rule, but does that rule kind of go to the wayside if it gets denied, goes to the?
Well, usually what happens if people are feeling like the process is fair and that people are being heard, and especially if there's a lot of things that they don't quite have the answers for that seem important, they probably would, you can't always know exactly what people are saying, but we have people waive all the time if they're being treated fairly. They'll go, okay, we'll waive the 120 days and maybe we'll do it in 150 or, whatever it is.
Okay.
Because it behooves them to try to get the answer they want. Mm-hmm. So if they have to get you the answers you want in order to get their answer, they're more likely to work, and try to go fair, because the whole point is if they have to hit reboot, then it's going to be another 120 days as opposed to, or more expensive, because then you have to start getting, legal representation and trying to go up through appeal processes and stuff. So that it's always good to keep in mind that we can't continuously just keep setting things over, but at the same time, if they're saying clues like, I really would like the opportunity to get that answer for you, that sort of thing, that's basically asking for a continuance, right? Mm-hmm. Without the magic word of please give me a continuance. So it wouldn't be the worst thing to say. It sounds like you might be asking to set this thing over to a date certain, mm-hmm. and then have that date certain, right? So the notice requirements are still being met. And I guess you'd have to work with.
And I just want to add one thing, and then Commissioner Hutchinson has a comment. I would say that the Planning Commission, as commissioners, I would like you to weigh out whether or not that information that person's coming back with is vital to the decision-making process or could be embodied in a condition of approval. That is a critical line in the sand and bright line, I think, in terms of, is that something that as a condition of approval you could make, or is it something that there's so much information that's missing that deserves another shot before this body?
Yeah, we've spent a fair amount of time discussing over variances, and that's, of course, very appropriate. But most of the time I've found that by the time they come here, they have it together, as much as they're going to have it together. And the biggest problems that I've seen is when somebody was just blatantly not ready, and they were trying to make a go of it, and we weren't debating definitions or whether this was enough space or that was an appropriate variance. It's like, there was major gaps. And it's like, that kind of thing kind of jumps out at you at the beginning. Once you start looking, I mean, you can just tell after having done a couple of projects that there's big pieces missing. And really, most of the projects, even the discussions for or against the variances are all very well laid out in the packet, in most cases. And, the one time where, we sent them on a long trip, I think there was also a little bit of, I don't know, kind of sniping. There was a little bit of verbal disrespect, I had kind of thought, in tone. And that also kind of gave people a reason to not. They felt like they were being threatened or strong-armed or something into a decision, and I was like, yeah, no.
And
Take a trip, and I'm not sure how appropriate that is, but, if you're coming to ask somebody for approval for your project, there's a certain amount of humility that is expected, and
Decorum is always helpful.
Yeah, and
I can think of one other case where, in that circumstance, I know which one you're speaking of, and I won't articulate which hearing that was, but but that was one that predated me and was set up, and we will never do type 3 and type 4 processes together ever again, because that was a disaster. Because you cannot assume things a council's going to be doing, and then you're weighing in on part of it as the body that's authority on type 3, and then parts of it go to council. But there was a case besides that case that I can remember where the applicant did not, it was a type 3 completely, and the applicant, kind of destroyed themselves by their own testimony. As staff, we really want to make sure that we're vetting that as well. There's a lot of backroom stuff going on Fully Complete, so our purpose is to not have that happen, but occasionally that happens. As much as you coach an applicant to try to get their act together, when they contradict themselves on critical issues about a project that has critical implications to parking and those kinds of things and the neighborhood compatibility issues, and it's a conditional use permit, that creates a lot of uncertainty. And so that was another case in point. And I think that one would have been well served by a continuance, because they simply did not have it together. And that was not apparent in their packet, because we read that and we got it. And then suddenly the storyline changes, and that's, another circumstance.
Well, and some people aren't great presenters.
yeah.
On this point, so like was said, a lot of times, not a lot of times, sometimes the presentation will come, and I think that when we're in this new format, and Dawn, this is something that I think Dawn is pushing, and I think it's a good thing, where we put the preponderance on the applicant, okay? And I've noticed a couple of times that what the staff report says and what the applicant's report says are not necessarily, they don't coincide. Now, I know that staff tries to catch all of that before it gets to us, but there's sometimes, and then also what the applicant will say, verbally will not jive with what the staff report was or what his report actually is. So I think that there are times, and I've been in hearings where we've sat there and the applicant he just said, you know what, I think we need a continuance, because they were just plain lacking in I don't know whether they just didn't get what, it wasn't your staff, but it was other staff. They just didn't get what the staff was saying or what, but there was obviously a gap.
Yeah.
I think that one of the biggest in this arena that we're talking about probably fall more on you, would be when we're going it down, and when that gavel drops and the public hearing portion of it is closed,
Yeah.
okay? And then we go into commissioner deliberation.
Yeah.
What happens there is then you have commissioners that will ask questions.
Yeah.
And of course, we can ask questions to staff, but we can't ask questions to the applicant and to the opponent,
Not without reopening the
not
hearing.
without reopening it. And that's critical, because if we ask the question to staff and staff says, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I don't know what they meant by that.
Yeah.
That's a critical point right there, because if you look up and say, well, what do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Okay, you can't do that.
Yeah.
You have to reopen the public hearing, because the applicant will then voice what he meant by that. But then the proponent or the opponent needs to have the same time to rebut that.
That's right.
In
Yeah.
that, and that's
For
a key-
fairness sake, for
That's a
sure.
key thing, and
Yeah.
I've seen groups stumble in that, because you all of a sudden just went off the rails if you let them, and they'll just sit on the edge of their seat and like,
yeah.
you know, just wetting their pants, you know, just because they want to say something. But without reopening the public hearing, you can't let them do that.
Well, and that's why I kind of get stuck on procedural.
Yeah.
You know, like what is a good procedural move when something like that happens? So let's say that is happening.
Yeah.
And the applicant is wetting his pants, wanting to.
Yeah.
He hears the conjecture going back and forth, and he's like, "That's not accurate," you know, or whatever.
Yeah.
Is that a motion event right there? Like, okay, I motion, or can I
Yes,
get a
that-
motion to reopen? And
You could entertain reopening if you want, if you think you have, I mean, again, you could look down at your docket and see, oh my gosh, I have 2 more of these.
Right.
And you didn't come prepared, and now, you know what I mean? So are you willing to say, are you asking for a continuance so that you're hearing some of these questions and it looks like you want to
Well,
answer
either
them?
that, or you have to make the decision.
Yeah,
You
or-
know, we've already talked about that, and you
Yeah.
would need to look at the commissioner and say,
Yeah.
and say, we've already talked about this, and you be the one to
Yes.
reiterate what was said, rather than reopening the public hearing,
gotcha.
okay?
That's
Now,
like
if you
juries.
if you can't reiterate it.
Somebody might remember independently on the board.
Yeah, and if you can't, if the commissioner doesn't look at you and say, oh, okay, yeah, okay, I get it, you know. If they look at you and say, well, that didn't answer my question, well, then
Then you have a decision to make.
Yeah.
you gotta either reopen it or no. But I think that's a really, that in any meeting, that is a legal catch point. That, because if you don't reopen it and there's somebody there that is an opponent and they're got their wits about them at all, that they're gonna take that shot, because it's you've opened it, but you haven't opened it. So,
Well, and so, yeah, if you do reopen it, you just want to be cognizant of how much time and attention you're giving one side and give that to the other. Do you want a chance to say anything on this? And I would really limit it to the topic at hand. You know, so like usually in law, if you have the rebuttal, then, you know, the rebuttal or whatever it's called, right? The rebuttal to the rebuttal has to be only to what came up in the rebuttal. So I would say do that too. Say, do you have anything on this particular matter that you wanted to be heard on?
can't
Because we
bring
just
new
heard it.
evidence,
Yeah.
can't bring new whatever.
And so, but the other issue is, yeah, just making sure that, because really, you're going to have findings and conclusions and an order that is predicated only on the evidence too. So, and what you guys say isn't evidence. And so you want to make sure too that you have enough evidence so it might also be a thing too, where if you're like, yeah, I would actually like to hear that because I want to make a decision if there's more evidence for me to actually make my final order and findings and conclusion on. So So that's another sort of decision, or right around that point. How much time do you have? Would a continuance be smarter, or would just reopening in a limited fashion be helpful?
And then also just quickly, like, we can punt over to Don and say, does this make sense? And he can clarify, like a judge would to a jury, right? He can, that's totally kosher.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just to add, I think the Planning Commission has done a really good job of asking their appropriate questions in most of the circumstances. I mean, I think, I can't really even think of a situation where it hasn't happened over the last year. Going back further, there was some like, let's race to the finish, and it was like not necessarily a really good exercise, because people would wait to hold on to a question that really should be let for the discussion for the body before the close of the hearing. That's really critical. I cannot overemphasize that, and that to a large extent would probably get rid of the issue of having to reopen the hearing.
Yeah. If
Because,
there's an
yeah.
essential point,
Yeah.
you probably want to try to get it
Yeah.
out of the lion's mouth in their time.
Instead of having a zinger at the end, which is like, what do we do with this? So, yeah.
Which singers are fun, but
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Before 9.
yeah.
Yes.
The second or third hearing, you just want to make sure and build a good record. But actually, clearly, though, we do want to make sure that we build a good record and that the evidence is in. And you don't want really an applicant or proponents or opponents feeling like they weren't able to get in everything that they wanted in. And so, I mean, the onus is on them to prepare so that they can get in what's supposed to be in, but at the same time, if it can quickly be done in a way that is fair to let a little more in, that's actually helpful. And this should go without saying, but this happens all the time. Evidence that is before you should be what was presented and what's in the packet. So if there's independent research or texts or sidebar talks, you know what I mean? Like that's part of your deliberation, then that really should be out and be a part of the record. If it's important enough to say to each other, and it's about the case at hand, you want to make sure that it's audibly on the record. And then of course you just don't want to be the person who texting the whole time and then somebody does a public records request for all your texts because they know for sure that you were on the phone with somebody who hates their guts or something. So just bear that in mind. I know in this day and age, I think people always have devices all around them, and so it's almost like they're not novel anymore. So people don't get as much heartburn about it, but I mean, I see people texting all the time at public hearings, and that could be subject to a public records request, so just keep that in mind too. But yeah, if it's important enough to say, don't just whisper it, make sure it's part of the record. Otherwise, do we have the next? Yep. Cool. We talked about equal time and opportunity to be heard. And then what I say here about principled approach, I think that should probably go without saying, but, the judge is supposed to be dispassionate, and not emotional, and just basically based on the facts at hand. And then applying the standards or the criteria to those facts at hand and not being emotional about it. So that's always helpful, just because you don't want to look like you're overly emotional about it anyway, but you also don't look as fair if you're really heated or you have an axe to grind, or if there's kind of a political bent on it that is driving what you're doing. So just try to make sure that it's not based on emotions or politics, but it's based on the facts that you're hearing and the criteria that you're supposed to run it through. So and then try to and you guys may or may not have this. I've seen people in the past do this, where sometimes the shotgun approach, somebody's just clearly not happy with whatever it is, and maybe a lot of people have complained to them ahead of time, and so it seems like the shotgun approach of they want it to be not that there's one or two or three essential, substantial issues that you really are, the crux of the case. They think that a shotgun approach will be helpful, and so there's like 1,000 little items that just like raising questions as if they're, raising reasonable doubt in a case or something, and so they just do the shotgun approach. I would always say that it always looks better and it always feels better and it's always easier to make a decision if you know kind of the substantial weighty issues, because all the little minutia probably, doesn't necessarily amount to much except looking kind of scattered.
Joe, just on that point, just a comment, for those items, kind of dealing with the record, and the record that's before the Planning Commission, speaking to the point you're speaking of, if there are topical issues that are brought up that are not part of that record, is that part of that discussion, which is what you're getting to, which is the outside elements, which I think get to, is that or is that not something that should be discussed? And, tangential issues, are they really appropriate in the discussion?
Well, and so, for one, you can't be here all night discussing the minutia anyway, but the other thing is, all of this gets distilled down to the few findings, conclusions, and in your order, right? So, the million little things aren't probably going to make that, and so really you're trying to best deliver on what that document's going to be handling. So it's really going to boil down to kind of the essential findings and conclusions, and not a whole bunch of stuff anyway, right? So if something does not meet those, then it doesn't meet those, and we'll know that, and we're about to get to the after hearing. But it's probably never a good idea to have it based on 1,000 little off to the side things that don't actually have clear and objective standards and criteria that it applies to anyway, if that makes sense. Sometimes it gets a little bit different, I guess, if there's like statewide goals and there's a million little reasons why it seems to add up to not meeting those, then that's probably a valid approach. But otherwise, I think you want to kind of stick to the big substance, if that makes sense. Do you have more to say?
No, I was that. Thank you.
And then, of course, there is a significant amount of vetting and work that goes into staff, and part of this is a trust exercise with the staff that they've kind of worked at having something that they think is, either going to pass, is recommendable or not, and for their stated reasons. And so it's always helpful, I think, to try to vet in your head why it is that the staff is recommending this and what their analysis is, just as kind of a double check on what you're thinking, even though ultimately you guys are the deciders, right? And so you don't have to follow what staff says, but you do have to follow, and you'll hear from the clear and objective standards, but we have to follow our own code and we have to follow our standards. But sometimes the system is set up because you are a check and balance on what staff's doing. So, but I just have a little section here which basically says you don't probably want to wholly discount it, because we have longtime professionals that work in the field, and so some of the conclusions that they've come to and some of the times that they've worked with the applicants, they're pretty, well, they're supposed to be entirely objective, really, right? You're not working on your buddy stuff necessarily. So it's always good to kind of try to figure out what they're analyzing and why. And then, of course, I have, during the hearing, the public relations piece, and this a little bit goes to the comment about they should come in with a little bit of humble pie or whatever it is, right? But I think we always want to look like we're, treating people with decency and doing the best possible attempt at fairness and kind of soundness and reasonableness and all that. I know a lot of judges want to always look like they're the most reasonable person in the room. So they actually like when, say, a prosecutor's a little bit hot and the defense attorney's a little bit, wily or whatever, so that they look like, the most reasonable person. And that isn't a bad standard to try to go for, right, is to be measured and reasonable. But as a public relations piece, consistency and fairness and all that is always helpful. The other thing is you'll get a reputation. So what's funny is people come through and eventually you'll see some of the same attorneys or some of the same companies and planners, and they pretty much know, like, oh, I got to watch out for that one. Like they're, so you almost become known kind of like the, when you have a Supreme Court or something, and they know different justices have different sort of, takes on things. So it is kind of interesting. I think you owe it to yourself to be consistent with yourself too. Yeah.
What happens if, just by virtue of the numbers here, we have enough for a quorum, but what happens if we're deadlocked as a committee?
Oh, so if there's 6 people and it's 3 and 3? Mm-hmm. Then
Does Dawn break the tie?
No. I'd have to look and see what the code says about a tie, but I believe it goes then to the council.
Okay.
I'd have to double check that.
Okay.
Because that makes sense. Otherwise, actually,
But then they just turn around and remand it back to us, wouldn't they?
probably. I hope for that 5th person or whatever it is. that those are hard sort of decisions, right? Is because it takes a majority to pass it, so then it would actually it wouldn't pass it. So then it would automatically be a denial in a way, right?
Well, and that's the question. What happens if we were deadlocked? Mm-hmm. Are we in a default continuance mode until a resolution? And that resolution means goes to council, then they perfunctorily just send it right back to us again to sort our issues out?
I'll have to look at the code, but just reasonably speaking, I believe, right, if you're deadlocked, you can't, it takes a majority to approve something, right?
Got it. So by default, it isn't
Yeah.
denial. Interesting.
So, and then, so we did that, closing the hearing, and we actually discussed all of these ideas. Is the idea of making sure, if you're going to set it over, that it's a date certain for the purposes, just helps everyone know what's coming up. So if and I don't know if you want to do it in advance, know which spots are open, say 1 or 2 hearings down the road, ahead of each hearing, so that we would have an open slot on such and such day, so that if some, say you have 3 hearings and you think maybe one might want a continuance, you'd say, yeah, well, the next really open slot would be such and such date. Just so you know, so there's a date certain.
And normally, we would probably not even get them to be on a hearing because they wouldn't be ready. I think we've had some unusual circumstances where, to your point, that we would really make that call and say, you guys just aren't ready, and then there would be another opening for that. We have a pretty good idea of what's up and coming, but the idea behind, some people are very, very close on this stuff, but it's, again, some of the stuff is fairly critical. The examination of the evidence is pretty detailed here at the Planning Commission, and we understand that, and so we don't really want to have something forwarded has a bunch of holes in it that it's both going to take all night and not respect your time, and secondly, they're just not ready.
And then, so then after the hearing, right, this is where you guys basically act as fact finder. And so again, you're kind of thinking for what that final conclusion and findings in order are going to say. And hopefully you're speaking out loud about it enough that staff hears what a plurality of you would want. Because some people might be only on board with 1 or 2 issues and maybe not all 4. and so it's always really helpful to kind of, as best as you can, deliberate out loud to, these are the reasons that I'm voting my vote.
And that's happened very consistently in the past, I'd say, 2 months probably, roughly. And I think that's, like the council does, I think that's extremely helpful. And also gives a chance for folks, I think, to abstain as well if they are going to make that abstention, or like wasn't here before. So I like that where, it's a roll call and like, here's my vote. And if you want to say comments on that, that's great. I think that works really well at the council level as well. So.
Well, and it's just helpful for us if we're creating the document, staff creating the document for you to vote on the next time around, right, is to kind of know what you'll actually vote off on. Create a document and then you're like, we didn't say that, or like, or I'm rejecting it for these reasons, you know what I mean? So we would want to know kind of what a plurality of folks actually are, interested in their reasoning why they did it one way or the other.
I think it's helpful because I think a lot of these are emotional, and I think the audience and the community feels appreciated to a degree where there is an explanation. I think that's helpful.
And then I add at the end too about when you're a fact finder, you really are weighing the evidence, and some of the evidence that you hear is kind of just straightforward kind of factual evidence, and some of it might be expert testimony. And one of the challenges whenever you're a fact finder is how do you weigh expert testimony? Because it kind of has a different weight to it than just lay testimony. Because it's coming from somebody who's presumably had enough schooling, had enough life experience, has the resume to go ahead and become kind of an expert in a field. A good example is our traffic analysis folks, right? These are laughing. No, but I mean the notion is.
You really want to go?
No. Well, sort of. Well,
I picked a different example.
Fences.
Well, and so maybe it's the perfect example, is that it's in a lot of trial work that if somebody has an expert and somebody doesn't have a rebutting expert, then how do you truly, it kind of takes experts to rebut experts. You know what I mean? Because you can't just have some angry neighbor coming in and saying, yeah, lies. There's a million cars. You know what I mean? And so it is kind of hard as a fact finder, because you're really are trying to do that sort of dispassionate, objective look. And so one side got their act together and hired an expert, whether or not you feel that expertise is awesome or not. But like if all the other folks didn't, and a lot of times opponents won't, right? They come in because they're neighbors or whatever. And so it is kind of hard, because they'll just say, well, I live on that street and it's gotten so bad that, I hate it. And so how do you hold up expert testimony versus anecdotal, a feeling?
And I think part of that, just to weigh in, I think the appropriateness would be clarification of the traffic study on page such and such. I have a question regarding this specific element. Would be the appropriate avenue versus disagreeing with data analysis from a legal expert, essentially. Because if something went to court, these people would be expert witnesses that we have hired that would go in front of a court. And that's where that would all go. So I think, just to your point, Joe.
Well, and I think sometimes in law, experts can be dethroned, by the idea that maybe they're biased, or maybe their approach was flawed, or potentially there's and I have the word learned treatise out here, but you can actually, rebut expert testimony with known, texts from the field. So, and some people become experts in, in Dewey case law, for instance. Some people have studied all of the manuals on how police are actually trained. So then they start asking, isn't it true that your actual texts say that you should do it this way and you didn't, right? You see what I mean? So there is a way to actually get at expert testimony that isn't just, well, I like grandma over here saying that, she hasn't seen this much traffic in years. So there are ways of kind of asking experts to kind of earn their keep, or, if you really want to get into it, but it is hard to just wholesale discount what an expert has to say with anecdotal, lay witnessing of something. So,
Can I ask a question about that?
yeah.
So my question is, I think it's related, but from my corporate world, if you as an organization are continuously using the same experts,
Yeah.
that can be problematic. So a lot of, corporations traded on, the stock market, they have to change out their accounting firms every so often, and sometimes they change out their legal firms, just to try to make sure that they're not always, quote, in bed with the same consultants all the time. Does the city do anything like that, like with traffic consultants or anything, or are there just not enough options?
I'll take a shot at that, Commissioner Jarosh.
Thank you, Ben.
I think in the traffic realm and the traffic world, the consultants that the city has hired, DKS, they're doing virtually 99%, if not 100%, public sector work. They're doing this for other cities. And most of them, those cities, Oregon City, Wilsonville, you name the city, they're pretty much involved in that's their bailiwick. They have no conflict of interest because they're not representing private sector. Most other consulting firms in the Portland metro region are doing both. And so really from a conflict perspective, they're probably the best firm in that sense to be using because they have no private sector conflicts. And
That's not really my point, I guess. And I'm not saying anything bad about any group or anybody. I just, I'm just trying to compare. But you get used to working with an organization, just like in the private sector world, they got used to working with their accounting firms. And oh yeah, they had a big four and they did work for everybody. But then guess what? People started maybe not looking at them really closely because they were in that role. It's more a case of, if you're always in bed with the same group, you get more comfortable than you maybe should. That's the point. Maybe there aren't options, I don't know.
And there could be, the city could seek those out. I'm not debating that point. I would say that, and this is just my personal experience and many, many years in the field in private sector and public sector, that the level of detail that we're getting on these traffic studies is at or beyond any other jurisdiction that we're dealing with. So it's not work that's inferior by any means. If anything,
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that at all. I just, anyway, there's a risk, there's an inherent risk in that, is all I'm saying.
no, and I understand.
Just like anybody would say, hey, Arthur Anderson did a great job, and they did it for IBM, and then what happened to Arthur Anderson, right? But their work was very detailed, and it was the best work at the time. So anyway, sorry, it's my background. I was just curious if that comes up.
It's a great question, Joe. Did you have other comments?
Well, I think Arthur Anderson's problem was they shredded everything when it came to Enron. Part of the issue, I think, is whether or not that's a consideration that can be done in real time by a body that's hearing one particular case versus whether that's a issue to kind of remind the council of when they hire folks or decide to use folks, because that just opens up a whole world of kind of, I mean, we've had the city's had the same engineer of record since I think the late 80s. So I mean, and does
I don't know that I agree with you, because let's say some cities, and this happened in West Lynn, by the way, their controller went on vacation and they had the same controller forever, and then they found oh, guess what? There was a big problem.
Yeah.
But the person had been with them for so long, they were intrinsically trusted.
And just a few other,
That's more performance issue stuff about, if you have contractors, we're supposed to always be revisiting the contracts, but if you have people who hold a position, then I guess you either, you trust that person by giving them the job or whatever, and then that person has that job unless and until, they want to quit, retire, or they go through the process of just cause where they get disciplined for doing something incorrect. So, I mean, and that's a
You continue using Arthur Anderson as your accounting firm for 30 years. Anyway, those are just examples.
so let me add a few other observations here. The city does not force anyone to use DKS. They can choose to use their own consulting firm. 95% is my guess of the developers are choosing DKS. They can choose other people. That's totally up to them.
Right.
That levels the playing field in many ways here. The other part is that DKS has a model that they're using. They did the transportation system plan in 2010. They've been hired as part of the comp plan update process as well. So there's continuity and consistency. I can tell you that the worst kind of situation you can get into, like in Southwest Washington, is you got 25 different traffic consultants all doing different traffic studies for different projects and absolutely no consistency. That's the reality where you get all that mix in there. So it's a different world, perhaps a little bit than the accounting world in that sense. But again, I think it's up to the applicant. They can choose to use somebody else. But they're, and it's not necessarily like that they're the least expensive in town, but I think part of that is there is a continuity to that. We're not twisting their arm to say, yeah, you have to use DKS. You can use other consultants, but I think the Planning Commission's probably only seen a few applications where there's been somebody different in that role. But again, it's up to the applicant to do that.
Right, but aren't they smart to use the ones that they know we're comfortable with?
Well, that would be true, but you could argue
Okay.
that is ubiquitously that you could choose anybody you want, and so there is an open market in some sense already in the situation that's out there. So that's just my point. So we're not forcing anybody to use them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I appreciate your comments, Judy. So the question I have is, applicant comes in for a project, and you say this project needs a traffic study. Whoever the people are that do the traffic study, you say the project needs a traffic study. Does the applicant make the phone call to the people doing the traffic, ABC traffic study people, and do they make the phone call to them and they say, we need a traffic study, this is the parameters, this is the project, and they enter into a contract with the traffic study people to do the traffic study? Now, the way it sounded like to me, you said that the city is hiring the traffic study people to do it, or is the city just saying you need a traffic study?
The way it works is there's a scope of work that DKS puts together for if there's a traffic study required. They put a scope of work together. They identify the cost for that work. If they're going to hire somebody else, they're still going to review it because the city does not have a traffic expert on board here. We don't have a staffer. So they have two options. They can pay for the traffic analysis that DKS will do, full on based on the scope of work, the traffic scope of work, or they can have DKS review that and have somebody else do that scope of work. So there's continuity in the sense of what is included in the traffic analysis for each project.
I guess my question is,
But the city has retained DKS For the reviewing mechanism.
For the scoping part of that, which is what is, that the scoping elements. This gets back to the reason we do that is we want continuity on the scoping elements. We do not want 25 different consultants like you have in Southwest Washington, all scoping 25 different projects in 1 square mile area, all coming up with different data. That's a nightmare.
But my point is this. If DKS or whoever, I don't want to beat them to death, but the city says we need a traffic study. The applicant goes and hires a traffic study. They can hire anybody they want. But the city says we need this scope covered. Is that correct? Am I right so far?
They identify, yeah, they
Okay.
basically, yeah.
So they go out and they hire. Now, of course, they know that historically we have applicants use such and such. It just doesn't, it almost doesn't seem like it would work because the applicant goes and hires the traffic study people and they say that and I understand that it comes in a scope of what the city wants it has to cover. But it would seem to me like the traffic study people, to make the applicant happy, because that's who they're working for, they're certainly not going to give them a traffic study that doesn't get their project pushed ahead. You see what I'm saying? A negative. They're not going to come through and they're going to say, no, I'm sorry, but you're absolutely insane. That's going to put too much, here and here and here and here and so on. And, because the applicant is going to, they get their project approved. The next people that come and bring an application to us are going to call that applicant and they're going to say, who'd you use for your traffic study? Oh, we used ABC. Oh, okay, good. Well, you got a positive result from them because the study people aren't going to they're not going to give a traffic study that is bad. They want to get they want to get hired again, and they want to get the project through for the applicant.
I would disagree with your analysis. The metrics are the metrics. Do you meet the level of service or do you not meet the level of service? That is the fundamental disconnect here in the conversation because it's measured based on level of service. If there's a standard, this is clear and objective.
Well, yeah, but the consultant firms had the accounting standards, the generally accepted accounting principles, which were also standards. So keep in mind.
It just seems like if the traffic study people were working for us. So in other words, you say we need a traffic study.
Yeah.
And it needs to cover this. And the city hires the traffic study people to give us a positive for our city. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for the positive quality of life in Canby. That's what we're looking for, okay? Not necessarily the applicant who's trying to get the project through. So we go to DKS or whoever it is, and we say, this is the scope we need, this is the traffic study, this is what they want to do, and we are the people that hire them, not the applicant. Maybe I'm...
Well, and it really, maybe it's the semantics here. DKS is really working on behalf, they're an extension of the city, really, essentially, was what that is. They're not really, they're working for the city, but they're putting together this application within the parameters of the city code. So it's not like they have a contract from XYZ consulting, XYZ machinery is not sending that, they're sending the information, they're sending the check through the city and then we end up reimbursing DKS, but their DKS is working on our behalf in that process.
So who's paying for them?
The firms are paying for them, so it's scoped out.
So the applicant.
The applicant's paying for, yeah.
Well, I thought the city.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. When I've been expert witness in the past, okay? People come, they say, we want you to be expert witness on this, okay? Now, I go and I give my expert opinion on whatever it is that we're doing. But if I'm hired by the defense, I'm working for them. Maybe I'm not making myself clear.
I could suss that out, so it sounds good. If you're an expert and you're hired by a certain side, they won't continue to retain you unless the theory that you really to espouse and believe in is to their advantage.
Okay.
Is that a fair assessment?
That's very fair.
Because I've heard of defense experts, it doesn't quite jive with, they don't like what they say, so they go, actually, you're not our guy anymore. We're going to go with the person who actually, the theory, they'll espouse a theory that actually works for us.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Ryan, go ahead.
Can I just add something?
Yeah.
I would also add that just because DKS or whoever is preparing a traffic study on our behalf, Don and I are scrutinizing those documents very closely. It isn't just because we're using one firm all the time doesn't mean we just take it in and it's like, oh, I'm sure it's good. We're scrutinizing those very closely and often have lots of edits and questions and requests for more information or more graphics or.
And Ryan, just to that point, any major project has to be reviewed by ODOT and Clackamas County. This is not a vacuum in any sort at all. Those agencies have to be involved and give the thumbs up and concurrence on that. I mean, especially when we're dealing with 99E. So that's part of that process as well. It's baked into our code. I know this is not the same, and it's probably hard for you guys to sort that out, but it's not the same as what you would have where, I would say the opposite really holds true, where somebody chooses somebody besides DKS. That is more truly a client-customer relationship thing on that end versus them saying, yeah, that's fine, we'll take the scope of work that you've given us, and that's X amount of thousands of dollars to do the traffic analysis. That gets deposited into city coffers, but we're managing DKS. So I would say they really are more of a branch of us. They're not really working for the developer. That may be with the perception, but that's not really how this is working.
So that is
Yeah,
the perception.
yeah.
And it is, and maybe what we need to do is, and I know this is getting away from the legal thing.
No, but it's good.
That's
Yeah, it's
actually
good.
really valuable.
Yeah.
It is maybe what we need to do is, at least for my benefit, I don't speak for the rest of the commissioners, but have it packaged in a different, sometimes it almost seems rubber stamped. And where you guys look at traffic studies all the time, we don't look at it, we don't live in that world to a degree that, I can look at it and, I know how to speak German, but if I have to sit down and read it, it says the same thing, but it's difficult for me to work through. And so maybe we just need to look at a different way. Because when we have these things and I question the traffic study, it's like I'm questioning you guys, and I don't want to be questioning you guys. I don't want to be questioning. I don't have a problem questioning DKS. I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah.
But with you guys, you have worked through it, you have looked at it and everything else, man. And sometimes I look at it and I think, how in the Sam could this be right? It just doesn't, you guys are saying, yep, staff says approval.
But to your point, though, let me ask you this question. So take a contractor out of it and say that we had a full-time traffic expert on staff here.
Mm-hmm.
And this process essentially was going through that individual who's on staff.
Mm-hmm.
That person's getting paid, getting city benefits, and making a judgment call and using their expertise.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're just saying we don't have the budget for a full-time traffic expert, and so we subcontract it out. That's all we're doing, right? They're the arbiter protecting our, as I understand it, they're the arbiter protecting our code.
Yeah.
We are hiring them specifically to protect our code, and an applicant can simply pay a fee for them to no different than what an employee would do for them if we had the budget for that, to create a traffic plan that is consistent with what we have said, right? Am I tracking?
That sounds fine. Then, for mine, just because I'm simple, maybe a different package as to how we see these traffic studies. I would like to see broader scopes, bigger areas, and we can go into that at a different time. But it is we talked about perception early on in the meeting. The perception is not, because I've had a number of people come and say, it just doesn't work.
The wolf is guarding the hen house.
It doesn't work. So anyway.
I think, just on that topic, as we're moving forward with the comp plan and TSP, in the next 6 months, there will be more discussion on that and continuous discussion over the next year. I would definitely want to have that continuous dialogue. We want to get to a point where it is so understandable to the planning commission that it's not a question, and we don't want to cloud over this either. We're just trying to explain it, and it's somewhat complicated. It's why we have experts here. I think it would be difficult to hire someone to keep them busy enough. So I think the city's probably getting a pretty good deal out of this without paying benefits, et cetera. And the market to pay a traffic person now would be really difficult, I think, to secure that, an individual to do that work. I think DKS does provide that service. I think there is perhaps, and this is good that we're talking about it, because I was not thinking that there was that perception that somehow they're working for the developer. In fact, if you called those guys down and asked them, their opinion probably is no, they're working for you. And that would be my belief. If you talk to the major developers in this community, they're not necessarily happy with the commentary that DKS is giving them. There's a whole discussion going on back and forth. Yeah, so that's perhaps part of the disconnect here as well.
So at what point do we as a community decide that we want Ivy to be a B grade street, say, for wait times? I mean, where is that standard set? Is it?
It's set now, it's in the code, and that will be reevaluated as part of the comp plan TSP. Those levels of service over the next 6 months will be reevaluated as to, what those are.
So my point is that these contractors that we are hiring, these engineers who go through a continuing education, I mean, they don't just get their certificate and go on their merry way. This is ongoing process for them, much like it is for electricians and other people like that. They are measuring against a standard that we have set politically through a process. I think one of the things is that's getting lost in the packet. And so when you say that this intersection is going to receive no appreciable increase in service, you can't just stop there. You have to say, as defined by the actions of city council relative to this. I mean, we could set a date or a policy, or, I mean, there's a document where you could refer to in the engineering report that they are measuring against. And so that we don't think that they're just saying, oh, no, it's good enough. Well, it's good enough based relative to some decisions that were made by elected officials in the past. And so it's not like they're just saying, no, it's good enough, just go home. No, somebody in the past has decided what's good enough for that intersection, and the engineering firm is measuring the change that they expect to happen relative to the existing standards for that intersection. And so, I think we need to be careful about articulating what good enough is for us and who gets to decide what good enough, so that the ire goes in the right direction. Because I don't think most people want to pay for the kind of traffic that they want to have. And we need to make sure that that conversation happens in the proper arena, rather than calling BS on the engineering results, or just calling, we don't trust their numbers. And it's like, it's an easy thing to say.
Wasn't that the thing, though? Wasn't that wasn't Portland State that set the standard? I'm just curious.
Well, I mean,
Isn't that
what an A or B is, but we decide as a community what streets are what grade of street.
Gotcha.
And unless it's an ODOT or a county
Or a
facility,
county
and they
street.
have their own adopted thresholds.
Right.
Yeah.
Our TSP.
Yeah, exactly.
To go back where you're, our TSP, we set that, God knows how many years ago, we're getting ready to set it
2010.
again. We're going to review all of these things that we, like you said, back when we did the TSP before, 13th Street was just a street. It was just a arterial. Well, we changed that, and now it's going to be a collector. Everybody got all upset about it at the time, but at that particular time, we changed that to be that, and that changed all the intersections and the loads and everything else. And so we're getting ready to do that again, and I think now is the optimum time, because if what you're saying, and I'm not doubting it, but what you're saying is true, and that's the way it works, then that's going to give DKS a whole nother standard by which they're going to be looking at all of our intersection streets and.
Yeah, there's 40 intersections that will get, completely addressed and studied in detail. I mean, everything that they're doing is meeting the standard now, but it will be a refresh of everything that we're doing in the city.
Right.
I do understand change is hard. It's hard to see congestion levels increase. I get it. I mean, we're not unsensitive to that issue. I think part of that is it's challenging. What we're trying to do is put a package together so it can be understood easily by the Planning Commission on a fairly technical level, and even the terminology, it's complicated. And perhaps that's part of what the evolution here. I think people get confused on things like in process. What's in process versus not in process, and then how do you calculate baseline of what you're doing, and then you put a percentage of growth on top of it. That all, I think, will be super helpful as we move forward. Some of you, I'm assuming, will be more actively involved in this than others, and some of you may be invited to be more active than others in that discussion as this moves forward. More to come on that, but just letting you know that is on the horizon, so we can then hopefully as a community come to grips with the fact of I don't quite get this, and I see this group as being part of the ambassadors for hopefully educating others in that sense. Our job is to educate you, and then you guys can help hopefully disseminate the word out more broadly.
Right.
So.
And it's okay to ask questions and demand answers from experts. So if something really doesn't sit well or doesn't seem, you know what I mean, it's good to ask the question, because that's also your the role up here is to not necessarily just buy what everybody's selling, but maybe put people through their paces a little bit. That concludes the portion of the after hearing, but what we're really doing is busting out a little bit more about being a fact finder. You also then have to run that through the filter of, what is the criteria and how are you supposed to kind of see if they're meeting the clear and objective standards that you're trying to get them to follow.
So I won't go ahead.
Step into something just before we get away from this segment.
Sure.
I looked up Robert's Rule of Orders online here on the tie vote thing, because I had a question in my mind.
Oh, okay.
I know that the council handles that because
Yeah.
the mayor doesn't vote.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if there is a tie for some reason,
Yeah.
then he steps in, he
Yeah.
votes and breaks the tie. I thought we used to do that in the commission, but apparently we don't.
Well, one of the problems is the commission's supposed to have 7 members.
Right.
They shall have 7 members. So one of the problems is not everybody participates every hearing, right? But ideally, we won't have that problem because there'll be an odd number, or that things will be mostly following, suit with what the code is.
But I'll turn my thing on here. So it says here, and this goes to your question, Matt, a tie vote by the commission shall be interpreted as a failure to approve the motion, okay, upon which the vote was taken. Now, in the past, when we've had that happen, what we do is the chair will ask for, do I have another motion? Because there might be a particular caveat to the motion that was presented that doesn't set well with the people, and they don't agree with it, or
Yeah.
whatever. So then if another motion made is that the vote still doesn't work, yeah, but anyway, if the motion, failure to approve the motion on which a vote was taken, additional motions may be proposed. If a tie vote remains on an adversary matter, the commission's actions will be deemed as a no recommendation. Okay, I remember that part. If a motion cannot be approved or approved on non-advisory advisory matters, subject to subdivision, a site plan, whatever, then the matter shall be deemed not approved, but may be brought back before the commission by the applicant. So if I'm reading that right, we're sitting here, we're doing it, we got a tie, we can't seem to break the tie. Is it up to the applicant to say, you know, we want to bring this back?
Well, they could either, there's a couple of ways to do that, right? One would be, I want to set over, and then I'm going to, try to impress the one missing person when they come in, you know, to kind of adjudicate the whole darn thing. Or they could potentially, you could write it up as a fine, write it up as a denial, right, because it's not an approval. We come up with a final order and conclusion and findings so that it can be appealed up to the next body.
Up to the city council?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I mean, that would be the two ways in which it could be handled. Yeah.
So I was going to touch on clear and objective standards. I won't spend a ton of time on this, but just wanted to, you know, kind of finish off tonight's discussion with what those are and versus discretionary standards. The state of Oregon has very specific and conservative kind of stance on land use, even more so, I'd say, than other adjoining states. I've worked in California and in Washington, and they have other layers of review that Oregon doesn't have. So everything really has to meet a clear and objective standard, which means it needs to be quantified in the code. Those kinds of things are setbacks, allowable uses, amount of pervious surface, building height, parking standards. So if they're in the code and they say, you know, this is what's required, and the developer meets those standards, we don't really have the discretion to say, well, we don't think that's enough. So it's really all comes down to the codification of that. Another example would be design standards in our design review process, which are scored. And I mentioned permitted land use, permitted residential densities. I won't go into traffic generation. We spent a ton of time on that. I was going to touch on it, but like that was a good discussion. So we have some work to do on that to help that be more understood.
You might have a comment on it.
Any more comments here?
Yeah,
Okay, no, she's on. Okay,
stuck in traffic.
okay.
Yeah.
So I'll continue with that, and then at the end, I'll let you guys weigh in. And so getting to discretionary standards, what are those? Well, discretionary standards are deviations. Some of those are baked into our code. For example, like in the industrial area, you'll see industrial applicant come forward because there's a carve out in our code saying it's not a variance, it's really an exception. If they can come up with a reasonable rationale for why they don't need to meet all the parking standards in the industrial zone and provide evidence to that, the Planning Commission has authority to grant it. Now, in the industrial areas, there are times that we've seen where, like our standards, and we need to revisit this too as part of our code update. I think industrial sometimes does have really intense parking standards, and it doesn't fit all applications. So we have had some situations where employers have come in and said, specific to this application, this is what's needed. That's one area of our code where I would say we probably have the potential to overpark is the industrial area. area. I think the commercial is another question, and that needs to get revisited. But so there's a deviation in our code on that the Planning Commission has authority on. And then full-blown variances, which are public hearing variances, the Planning Commission has authority to approve those, and conditional use permits have discretionary standards in them. And that would be, those are the parts that are not clear and objective. They have discretion, which means that you can kind of go outside of the parameters on those, and they're more subjective.
But you don't have to.
Yeah.
So if they're asking for a variance, they could be told no.
So there are, I mentioned the parking standards, and then we have another thing in our code that we probably need to revisit as well, which is, some of you may have encountered this on some subdivisions, the length of frontage, and there's some subdivision standards on the length of frontage. Does not give a lot of parameters about adjusting the length of frontage, but it's in our code as well, that some applicants have used. It's been infrequently used, but that's one that's baked into our code. The other ones, like height variance, those are discretionary variance to setbacks, and uses subject to conditional use permits, as I mentioned before. The one thing I did want to mention is House Bill 3414 that is up and coming in the current legislative session. We're still just pretty fresh off the press and finding out about the details of this, but speaking of clear and objective standards, we're going to want to really hone in on what those are as we update our code, and make those very clear. The state, and I'm going to kind of not go into a lot of depth on this tonight, but the state is really going to make it more difficult to deny variances in circumstances where there's housing involved, and such as variances to setbacks and parking. Not density, not height, but this bill actually is coming forward that is going to make it essentially prohibitive unless that can be shown as fire life safety is in play there. Part of our discussion with Joe, and I don't want to go too far down the path here, but part of our discussion with our council here is to talk about how we can, really beef our code up to be very clear and objective, and hopefully, have the ability to not have challenges where developers are coming in and said, well, you can't deny me because of the House bill that's coming into play. This all is part 3414. It's 3414, yeah.
So we're going to have to figure that out.
So there's some issues, and part of it is I didn't want to go into a deep dive tonight, but just this housing issue is, in addition to everything we're doing, trying to scramble to provide options, which I think is a better way of doing it, is just to try to have a grassroots review of what's going on, what the need is, and coming up with creative solutions. The legislature is trying to help, but I think in some ways they kind of go full on into stuff that they don't really understand exactly. And so some of this, though, is coming, and so we're going to have to deal with it. And so I don't know exactly when this will be in play, but it's 90 days after the session ends, and I'm not sure when that's going to be. So if that continues forward, but just it's another way of the legislature trying to look at things to try to create more affordability. And that's something we won't have a lot of discretion on. And part of this is discussing how we can create our own codes that are kind of like, well, yeah, we've already addressed those, and therefore, we have hopefully greater authority than what that says in the House bill. I just wanted to throw that in there, which is kind of weird that the state's taking that, because all the template for, like I mentioned at the beginning, is that Oregon is all about clear and objective standards, but yet the state is kind of like saying, but yet, we're starting to take away some of those a little bit. So that's more to come on that. That's probably going to require its own session of discussion. Near term, we're looking at more things like what we talked about previously, which the Planning Commission will continue to have a role in, like planned unit development ordinances, cottage cluster ordinances, overlays on commercial where you have housing above commercial below, those kinds of things, and that will continue. You'll see more of that probably April, May. That's when that's going to start to come back. So just a heads up on that. I think that brings us to the end. So if there are questions that you have on this, if you don't, we know obviously, well, if you have questions at another hearing, glad to address those. But if there's anything tonight that you guys would like to talk about regarding our presentation, let us know.
Commissioner Jarosh, are you still with us?
Yeah, did you have your speaker on?
I do now. Thank you.
Okay, I can kind of hear it when you don't have the speaker on, but
Sorry.
I just want to say thank you for this. This is my third time through this training, and as, I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, Joe, the more you go through it, the more you learn, and I appreciate the time that it takes to put this together and to sit down and have this discussion with us. It's incredibly helpful, so thank you.
Hey, I appreciate that, and I appreciate everybody's willingness to do it, but then also a willingness to push back too, because I do think that, we work with human endeavors. And so it is important that you guys are human beings up here doing kind of important work for our community. And it isn't a one-size-fits-all either. So I just appreciate you guys taking the time and the energy to try to wrestle with it and do your best. So
Thank you. And also the training that Don had talked about, I can't remember if it was a professional organization, but when I went through that was really helpful too. So thank you.
You're welcome. And I'm looking, Commissioner Jarosh, I'm looking for more. Typically they come up for like March, April, more opportunities, and I'll let you all know about those. I have not seen them yet, but that's about the time. They're springish, and they'll be in the evening, so it's not really a conflict during the day. But if that's something, it's totally up to you, voluntary. If you're interested, anyone on the, it'll be offered to everybody.
When I went,
They
there
were
was
super
pizza.
great last year. Thank you.
food always makes it better.
Commissioner Hutchinson, any final thoughts?
No, thanks. Thanks for the discussion. I appreciate it. I don't really think that there's too many times where you talk about ethics, and it's really important that our opinions have the integrity that we think that they should have, and our behavior gives them that. So keep it up. Thanks.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
Commissioner Llewellyn?
No, I appreciate this. Thank you. Being a newbie and everything, so this is good.
Vice Chair Ewert?
I said enough. Thank you.
Well done.
Was that a motion, or was that a?
Don't let my wife hear that.
Thank you very much, Joe. Appreciated that.
Sure.
It's way cooler in person than watching it on YouTube, so
Yeah.
I appreciated that a lot. And thank you, Ryan, for jumping in and also clarifying, and thank you, Don. If nobody has anything else, I believe we can move on to adjourn. Unless
We have
Mr. Hutchinson has some.
Chair Ellison, items of interest from the planning staff. I was hoping to touch on a few things.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'll be
Sorry.
short.
promise.
Get us out of here. So 5:30, I want to repeat this, 5:30 this Wednesday, March 1st.
Yes.
I know some of you may be challenged to get here at that time. We're moving up the joint work session, Planning Commission City Council work session up to 5:30 to give a little bit more time. Again, housing and employment being touched on, specifically to get a good dialogue going, having a little more time to discuss. And also in light of the fact that we're going to launch into hearings, the Planning Commission hearing, the next one, March 13th, will be on housing production strategy. And so that's timely with the March 1st joint work session. And then on March 27th, the economic opportunity analysis will be before the Planning Commission. Those will be then moving forward in April and May to council for adoption. So that's what we got near term going on for those items. So I'm hoping you all can attend the joint work session this Wednesday. Our consultants will be here to discuss. We'll have an open dialogue around that. I know there may be many questions about that. We do have and some of this is going to continue to evolve in terms of after these items are adopted into our comp plan and the visioning process. And there'll be more discussion on that as well, but it's going to segue into that next step. But if there are questions on that, either right now or later, let me know. Happy to answer those, but just wanted to put those out there.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So I went to the meeting that we had the other night. Good meeting. It was very, very informative. We got to get more people involved in this thing, and I'm just gonna beat this. We talked about it the other night. I'm gonna talk about it now because we've got an open session. And I don't know how many people are listening online, 3 or 4, I'm sure. But anyway, we only had 61 people respond to the survey. This is critical stuff that's going on. And I don't want to make these decisions in a vacuum. And we've got to get the survey. I don't know how to do it, but we've got to take advantage of, and I keep saying this, and I don't ever hear a reason why we don't do it, but I know that everybody in town gets a power bill, sewer bill, whatever. Why can't we stuff those mailers with and say, public survey on this, go to here and get it? Because I don't think people are getting the only way people are finding out about this is because I tell people, my wife tells people, those friends maybe tell people, but it just kind of dies. And those of us who are in the circles know about it, but 61 people out of the thousands that live in town is just not a good representation. To make these decisions, we've got to know from more people. And so I don't know. It came out in the paper, got Dawn's glorious picture in the paper here the other day, right on the front page. You need to smile more, Dawn.
Yeah.
But it was that's great. But I don't know. I don't even know with we still take the Canby Herald, but I don't know. 61 people tell me that not too many people are reading the article and responding. And so we've got to get maybe something else.
And there was, and I don't disagree with you. There was a prior, because you'll see all this on the 13th. There was a prior open house in the summer 2022, and followed by a survey, and there were 80 people on that, which is slightly better. I agree. We're struggling with that as well. The idea on the sewer insert, I can revisit that. I asked about that at one time. I'm not sure what the answer was, back on that, but I'd be happy to revisit that. Going forward into the comp plan, I can tell you for sure we have consultants that are on board, and part of that is a public input. They're a large outreach group that is going to be part of that, and they do granularized outreach and broad brush. And again, I was surprised too. It was in the paper, and the paper had the link. That was a second article, actually.
Yeah.
That was the first one. It was in December. So we're trying to get the word out. That would be great if we had more input. I think part of this is, it's not quite as exciting as the Parks program. I think people are not as excited about it.
But it's way more important.
It probably is equally important, if not more so. Yeah.
Can I say something?
Yes.
My experience has been, contentious gets more people involved.
Yeah.
I think you got to stir the pot. And that might take stronger wording on a survey, or stronger wording in an advertisement, but stir that pot. Get people angry at stuff. They'll respond.
Just not too angry.
Yeah. Well, I think getting people, but when you do that, people come in, and a lot of these people that are against something just have lack of education. And we've dealt with that a lot in that industrial park, and getting them to even get educated sometimes. If somebody tells them something and they believe it, it's quite amazing. But I think, maybe the way you're wording it, throw something in there that'll stir the pot. It's done all the time.
The QR code that
We
goes
could-
straight to the survey,
we could-
we could cut and paste that.
Yeah.
And then, put it on the sign that says skyscrapers in Canby, take the survey.
Whatever it is.
Shock appeal.
That's funny.
I mean, it might be something stupid, but I think,
Yeah.
you got to get people angry, That's what gets them motivated. Look at the dog park.
Judy, you were saying something?
Sorry, we could, if we could develop a little elevator speech, and then give it to each board and commission to, just announce at their meetings, the library board, the park and rec, everybody, that also could help spread the word a little bit.
Well, we can probably work with our communications folks, and then also with people the staff that go out and participate in various clubs and things like that too, and maybe take some flyers or, little slip of paper that.
I personally think Canby Big Night Out would be tremendous, and you get a beer token for a survey. Coors Light, there's no shortage of that in this town. I think that's going to be a
big
huge
party.
hit.
Big city party, that's what I was going to say.
Well, and I think too, the fact that we would say, we want to hear from you, because there's a whole segment in town that believes you really don't want to hear from them.
Yeah.
And I get that all the time, and I keep telling people, that's not true. We want your input. No, they're going to make decisions whether we fill out the survey or not. So there's that group of people. Then there's a group of people that I think the shock appeal is it, I don't even know what the shock would be to get people to fill out the survey, but if you don't fill out the survey, your property taxes are going to quadruple. I don't know what it would take, but
But it's going to take something crazy like that. You got to wake this town up. It's asleep.
you just got to wake them up, and because there's so many. And I agree, Greg's right. I mean, we just got to and it's got to be a shock. I mean, it's just got to be. It's got to be those people that say it doesn't do any good. The people that just aren't paying attention. Somehow, I pulled into Thriftway today, and the policeman came up behind me and turned on his lights. Got my attention. Okay, he was getting the guy in front of me, thank God. But anyway, it got my attention, and somehow in this process, we've got to throw on the lights. And when we open this up to a public hearing, and we're going to have maps out, hopefully, and people can put, that's what we did last time. They put little stickers where they wanted to see us grow and so on and so forth.
And that's part of the community visioning. I mean, this is the first step in that process. I mean, I think it's not the end step, the housing production strategy, the economic opportunity analysis. It's the beginning of that comprehensive plan update. I mean, it really doesn't have tangible legs to it without policy direction, which comes out of the comp plan. And I think we have a good plan of attack to get the more of this outreach with the consultants that we've hired that have these powerful tools, web-based tools. But it's been a struggle. I mean, I just acknowledge what you're saying. I mean, we want to hear from people. We want to know what the vision of the community is. I mean, this is the chance to do that. And this has not happened very often.
Yeah.
This may not have ever happened in terms of the comp plan process. I know, there was some visioning in 2013, but it was it never resulted in okay, here's our next step. So I don't know if the community is really used to that either. So what does that mean? So there's some education we need to do. I need to talk to Kelsey at the paper again and get more advertising. That's really good free advertising when we have articles that come out in the paper. I've got to believe thousands of people take that paper here. I've got to believe that. Yeah.
So, we laughed about this, but, I do a lot of events to try to get people come to them. Food and drink do work.
I'm telling you, we're on to something. Tokens. Now get Jamie on this. We can do this thing. It's going to be good.
Should we get a band too?
Yes,
A little
we
rock
have
and
one.
roll.
Dump trucks on 99E. That should get a lot of people's attention.
Yeah.
It should. Sorry. Anyway.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you. That was all I had.
Okay.
Where's Walnut Street at, Extension?
So Walnut Street Extension, quick update. The ODOT access permit is literally on the 1 yard line on getting submitted. The engineering is done. The application, I signed it today. Public Works has signed it. They sent it over to me. There's a few pieces of information that are still missing to be a complete application, which are fairly easy to get. Title report, property deed, those two things. And then once that is all packaged, it's going to go into ODOT and start that process.
Okay.
So that's where that's at.
So we're timeframe.
Well, this is based on the update that happened about 3 weeks ago from Kurt McLeod and Jerry Nelzine, but they were talking 12 to 18 months to get through the ODOT access permit process. They're talking 24, 25 for construction of the I mean, we'd love to have it sooner. I mean, it will parallel. I mean, I thought the comp plan actually was going to be behind, but we're probably going to be slightly ahead of that process, which, I mean, it's an important element. It's important for the industrial area. It's important for that special area J for that development in that area. And, many of the aspirational objectives of those things we've talked about will be that. And in addition to alleviating a lot of traffic congestion. So it's an important project. It's a high priority for the city.
So we talked before about, can we do a meeting where we can look at some history of those roads, kind of what was thought about in the past and kind of what's out there?
There's going to be, as part of the comp plan process, there will be discussions on, and I would love to get your input on that with, we talk offline with, getting DKS up to speed on that, because I think that would be really helpful. They're doing the transportation side of things, so I'd be happy to set up a meeting to specifically talk about that, to get that history, which I think would be helpful.
Yeah, I'd like to see some of those roads and if, how they were planned. It's been a while since I've looked at that. And I guess my other question too, so the city engineer, is that the only engineer that you ever used? Do you ever bring in a second opinion at any point in time?
Well, so, yeah, we have an engineer of record, but then we actually have done a request for qualifications where there were 4 other firms that were deemed usable because of their qualifications. So yeah, we've experienced where, depending on the project, hire whatever firm it is that seems kind of fitting at the time. And then on that particular one, we did a request for qualifications just for that, and the engineer that prevailed applied and was through the process selected. So, but yeah, which happens to be the engineer of record, but in some cases we've used various engineers for programs. So
Yeah, I'd love to see some of the history of that in the last few years. Mm-hmm. Some of those roads that were planned quite a few years ago, what happened to those?
Are you talking for that area up there, the Special J, or just in general?
Well, there was a road, Auto Road was planned at one point.
First, yeah.
And I'd really love to come back and look at that and see what happened there.
Oh, part of we did an amendment to the TSP for the, before we could even use any of our funds on Walnut Street, it had to be part of our transportation plan. And so what we ended up doing was amending that. Ryan was here at the time too.
Yeah, I can send you the staff report that explains some of the rationale for why the auto road, why it moved locations.
Yeah, because, in the early days of planning all this, several engineers OTAC was very heavy involved in planning that, and Walnut was never considered for that third extension out to 998. And Hazeldale Way was designed specifically to, and it would have been a hell of a lot cheaper, heck of a lot cheaper to taking that road out. So it'd be interesting to see that, what happened there.
Yeah, part of it was the spacing between where Territorial crosses and Sequoia. My understanding is the new Walnut alignment is more equidistant between the two intersections, and also the original Auto Road. It's a quite a big incline to go up from 99,
Right.
where the new alignment kind of follows the wetlands that are through that area, so it's more of a consistent grade.
Yeah, it'd be interesting because there's a lot of engineers that worked on that at the time, so it'd be interesting to see that.
But I think the waterways for auto made it a little, would have actually been more expensive.
I guess,
But again, well,
I would love to explore too, is how can we connect that downtown to the industrial park out there, right? That's kind of that point of that thing was. It's pretty vital, I think, to do that. You're talking about growth going out to the north and east, and when that happens, you just kind of envision Beaverton, Tiger, Tualatin, and as that grows out there, just like Happy Valley's doing, you're going to get these neighborhood areas down. People aren't going to come down. You got to have a reason for people to want to come downtown, especially more and more as you go that way. Or this will die again. So I'd love to look at that road system.
Yeah, as we get in, and we are in contact like regularly on, I do a weekly check-in with DKS on just kind of where things are at, but be happy to, I think there'd be some value to that. I could connect, we could set up a meeting, and absolutely, I think your input would be helpful. There's a lot of history. I mean, it goes back at least 20 years. I mean, if not more. I mean, I know there's some documents.
25 years.
25.
Actually, probably it was the mid-90s.
Yeah, I have some of the reports on my shelves from OTAC
Yeah.
when they were doing the industrial analysis.
Yeah, we did it right over there in Thriftway.
Yeah.
Quite something.
does it sound like a good start would be at least the staff report?
Yeah, I think that would help at
When we
least
last amended
on
the
the
TSP.
basis of design, or like at least with the parameters around that. I think that would be answering that question. But the overall history as to, where things are at, and kind of like that would be helpful, I think.
Yeah. One of the reasons that, again, I think I probably beat this horse to death, but the property owners out there got involved in this is because what it would do for downtown Canby, but that's never evolved because that road system never got put in. And it's a major missing link, I think.
Well, and hopefully, what's interesting about the comp plan coming online at the same time, or close in time with the new TSP and also what will inevitably be the development concept plan for that special area J, is it will finally start to get built out, some of that stuff. Whereas, and I don't know if that's the only area you're thinking, but that whole area has just kind of been waiting for. Now it's waiting for Walnut Street, but it's also waiting for the comp plan to kind of do the heavy lifting so that they can, use that and come up with a development concept plan that then we can annex in, and they can start to kind of add infrastructure and stuff.
This goes on and on in my mind, but it kind of goes back. He said this last meeting that that park took a while to get going. There's a reason why that took a while to get going, and I think you're gonna come up against these things again when you expand that industrial park. You can't do the industrial park the way you did it the first time. You'll never get those owners on board. You had all the owners on board in this one, and then the city, and then people didn't want the growth, and so we just fought that. But that's why that park took so long to go, and we spent months and months and hours putting that overlay zone on the park, apartments and storage units. The reason that I got thrown out is because the city got so desperate to get something going out there. It's craziness. If we don't. Right back to Dan's point, if we don't get more involvement, especially in the property owners, where you want to expand this thing and do things a little differently so they know they have a game plan. Because 20 years from now, it'll be a whole different, we may not even be alive, right? And so you
I
get,
don't want to talk like that.
yeah, and but you get,
You don't want to talk like that?
but we were fighting, but everybody has an opinion, right? So we were fighting city staff that didn't agree with it and blah, blah, blah. It was like, well, we weren't here 20 years ago to fight that.
Yeah.
Right? But you put those property owners in a real pickle. So to get those properties on board now, you're going to have a better plan than you had the first time, because you're not going to get what you had the last time. Especially now that they have history and they saw what happened in that first round and how those property owners got treated. You've got a problem there already. So I'm for it. I think it needs to happen, but I think the city needs to take ownership at the get-go, and it needs to take it every year going forward, because that got lost the first round. So.
We'll follow, I can follow back up with DKS, and we'll talk more. That was it for planning staff.
Okay, Commissioner Jarosz, final, any thoughts?
No, thank you.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Hutchison,
I move we close.
do we have a second?
I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
We have closed for the evening. Thank you very much, Canby.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Jerry.